In the spring of 1878, when the Brazos River ran high with snowmelt from a winter that had refused to loosen its grip, Fanny Maddox buried her husband on a hill overlooking the ranch he had built with his own two hands, and every man in Palo Pinto County waited to see how long it would take the bank to run her off the land. She was 26 years old, widowed 6 days, and standing at the graveside in a black dress that had belonged to her mother, watching the dirt fall onto the pine box that held Thomas Maddox, when the county assessor rode up with papers already drawn. Thomas had died of a fever that came on sudden after a spring branding, the kind of fever that took strong men in 3 days and left their wives holding notes they had never seen and debts they had never signed for but were bound to just the same. The Maddox Ranch owed $1,100 to the Fort Worth Cattle Bank, due in full by the 1st of October, and everyone from the preacher to the barkeep at the Bristled Ox Saloon in Palo Pinto figured Fanny would sell out cheap to Jasper Coyle, the only man in the county with cash enough to buy her outright, and be back east with her sister in Missouri before the bluebonnets faded. Fanny had other notions. She sat that night at the kitchen table with Thomas's ledger book open in front of her, a single tallow candle burning low, and she did the arithmetic 3 times because she could not believe it the first 2. She had 1,100 head of longhorn cattle grazing on grass that belonged to nobody in particular, cattle that were worth $4 a head in Texas, and could fetch $25 or $30 a head if she could get them to the railhead at Dodge City, Kansas. The math was simple enough for a child to work out. 1,100 head, driven 600 miles north along the trail Thomas himself had walked twice before they married, sold at the railhead, and she would not only pay off the bank note but have money left over to see the ranch through winter, and then some. The trouble was that no one believed a widow woman could hold a herd together across 600 miles of open country, through river crossings and lightning storms and Comanche country, and the 1,000 other ways a cattle drive could go wrong even for men who had done it a dozen times. She rode into Palo Pinto the next morning anyway, her dead husband's Colt Navy revolver belted at her hip, because she had decided somewhere in the night that she would carry it whether or not she ever fired it, and she told the men loitering outside the feed store that she was hiring hands for a drive to Dodge City, wages of $30 a month and found, and she would leave in 2 weeks whether she had 10 men or 2. Most of them laughed. A few of them looked at their boots and mumbled something about needing to speak to their wives. Old man Prout, who had ridden with Charles Goodnight himself back before the war, spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and told her plain that a trail boss needed to be able to whip any man in the outfit into line, and no woman alive could do that, God rest her husband's soul. Fanny looked him dead in the eye and said, "I do not need to whip a man to make him do his job, Mr. Prout. I need to pay him fair wages and treat him honest, and if that is not enough to keep him in line, then he was never worth hiring in the first place." Prout did not sign on, neither did most of the others. By the end of that first week, she had exactly 3 men willing to ride for her. Her late husband's younger brother Ezra, who was 17 and eager but green as spring grass, an old freed slave named Moses Freeman, who had cooked chuck wagon for 3 drives already, and asked no questions about who was giving the orders so long as the pay was honest, and a boy named Tobias, who could rope well enough but had never been north of the Red River in his life. It was Moses who told her about Clyde Sawyer. "There is a man drifted into town 3 days back," Moses said, stirring a pot of beans over the fire behind the Maddox barn where the small crew had gathered to plan. Rode with the Shanghai Pierce outfit 2 years running, then the Loving Goodnight Trail before that. Word is he does not want to work for Jasper Coyle on account of some bad blood between them, and Coyle is the only outfit hiring drovers right now besides you, ma'am. Then he ought to be easy enough to find, Fanny said. She found him the next afternoon at the livery stable, A lean man of perhaps 30 years with sun-cracked skin, the color of old saddle leather and pale gray eyes that seemed to take the measure of everything they landed on. He was checking the shoes on a rangy bay gelding when she approached, and he did not look up right away, which she took at first for rudeness before she realized he was simply finishing a task he had started, the kind of man who did not leave things half done. "Mr. Sawyer," she said, "I am told you have driven cattle to Kansas 3 times. 4, he said, still not looking up. "You would be the widow Maddox." "I would be Fanny Maddox," she said, and something in the way she said it made him finally straighten and look at her properly. "I am putting together a drive to Dodge City, 1,100 head. I need a trail boss who knows the country and is not afraid of taking orders from the woman who owns the herd." Clyde Sawyer studied her for a long moment. She was not what he expected. He had heard the talk around town, the way men spoke of the widow with a mixture of pity and scorn, as though her grief and her stubbornness were the same failing. But the woman standing in front of him had steady brown eyes and a jaw set like she had already decided the argument was over before it began, and there was something in her bearing that reminded him, oddly, of officers he had known in the war, men who led not because anyone had given them permission, but because they simply would not consider failure as an option worth entertaining. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended," he said slowly, "but a drive like that is hard on men who have done it a dozen times. River crossings will drown cattle and men both if you are not careful. Stampedes happen in the dark for no reason at all. There is Comanche and Kiowa country to cross, and outlaws who would as soon take your herd as look at you. I have seen good trail bosses lose half their cattle and their nerve besides. I am aware of the dangers, Mr. Sawyer. My husband told me plenty about them before he died. I do not aim to be reckless. I aim to get my cattle to Dodge City and pay off my debts and keep my land. I am asking you because I am told you are the best trail hand left in this county who is not already working for Jasper Coyle, and because I have heard you do not much care what people say about who is giving the orders, so long as the orders are sound." He almost smiled at that. Almost. "What is it you are offering?" he said. $40 a month as trail boss and a share of 1% of the herd's sale price at Dodge City on top of your wages. That was more than fair, more than most outfits offered, and they both knew it. Clyde Sawyer looked at her for a long moment more, weighing something private in his own mind, some old grievance or old wound she could not see, and then he nodded once, short and businesslike. "I will need to see the herd before I commit to anything," he said. "And I will need final say on the men we hire and the route we take. If you cannot abide that, ma'am, you had best find yourself another trail boss." "Agreed," Fanny said, and put out her hand the way she had seen men do when they sealed a deal, and after a moment's hesitation, Clyde Sawyer shook it. They rode out to the Maddox spread together that same afternoon, and Clyde spent 2 hours moving through the herd on his bay gelding, counting head, checking hooves, noting the mix of steers and cows and the handful of young bulls that would need cutting before the drive began. Fanny rode alongside him and answered his questions plainly, without pretense, and by the time the sun was dropping toward the western hills he had decided 2 things. First, that the herd was sound enough to make the drive if the weather held and the crew was competent. Second, that Fanny Maddox was not the fool or the desperate widow the town made her out to be, but a woman who had clearly spent more time than anyone credited her for learning her husband's business right alongside him. "Your husband taught you well," he said, as they turned their horses back toward the ranch house in the fading light. "My husband taught me some," Fanny said. "The rest I learned by watching and asking questions nobody thought a wife needed answered. Thomas used to say I asked more questions than any man on his crew. I do not think he meant it as a compliment at the time, but I have come to take it as one." Clyde Sawyer laughed then, a short surprised sound as though it had escaped him before he could stop it. "I imagine you did, Mrs. Maddox." "Fanny," she said, "if we are to spend 3 months on the trail together, Mr. Sawyer, you had best call me Fanny." "Then you had best call me Clyde," he said, and something passed between them in that moment, quick and unremarked upon, a recognition of sorts, though neither of them could have named it yet. The 2 weeks that followed were the busiest of Fanny's life. Clyde hired 4 more hands, men he had ridden with before and trusted, though even they raised eyebrows at the notion of working under a woman's ownership. There was Hank Dietrich, a broad German immigrant who had come to Texas after the war and could handle a wagon team better than any man in 3 counties. There was a Mexican vaquero named Rafael Ortiz who had grown up on horseback and could rope a running steer from 40 feet without thinking twice about it. There were 2 brothers, Wade and Silas Colby, who had driven cattle before but had a reputation for drinking too much when they reached a town, which Clyde warned them plainly he would not tolerate on this drive. That gave Fanny a crew of 8, counting Clyde and Moses at the chuck wagon, along with young Ezra and Tobias, to move 1,100 head of longhorn cattle 600 miles across some of the roughest, most unpredictable country in North America. It was a small crew for such a large herd, smaller than most trail bosses would have wanted, but it was what money and reputation could buy her, and Fanny was determined to make it enough. On the morning they set out, the 3rd of May, the whole county seemed to have turned up to watch, some out of genuine well-wishing and most out of simple curiosity to see how far the widow would get before she came crawling back or, worse, did not come back at all. Jasper Coyle himself rode out from town on his fine black stallion, dressed in a coat too fancy for the dust and heat of a cattle drive, and made a show of tipping his hat to Fanny with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I will keep your ranch in mind, Mrs. Maddox," he called out, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear, "in case you find yourself in need of a buyer come autumn." "I will keep that offer in mind the same way I keep a rattlesnake in mind, Mr. Coyle," Fanny called back, and a ripple of laughter went through the onlookers, and even a few of the men who had refused to ride for her found themselves grinning despite their doubts. Clyde Sawyer, sitting his bay gelding at the head of the column, caught her eye and gave her the faintest nod of approval, and Fanny felt something steady settle in her chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel again so soon after burying Thomas, though she pushed the thought away before it could take root. There was no room on this drive for anything but cattle and grass and water and the long road north. She told herself that firmly, and she believed it mostly. The first weeks of the drive went as well as any trail boss could have hoped. The herd settled into a rhythm, moving 10 to 15 miles a day when the grass was good, less when it was not, grazing as they walked, watering at the creeks and rivers that crossed their path. Fanny rode drag more often than not in those early days, eating the dust kicked up by 1,100 cattle, because she refused to let any man on her crew think she was there merely to give orders from a comfortable distance. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her face burned brown under the relentless sun despite the wide-brimmed hat she wore. She learned to sleep sitting nearly upright against her saddle, learned to eat beans and salt pork and hardtack without complaint, learned the particular ache that settled into a rider's hips and thighs after 14 hours in the saddle. Clyde watched her from a distance those first weeks, saying little beyond what the work required, though Fanny noticed the small things. He was the first to check that her horse was properly rested. He made certain she got a fair portion at mealtimes when Moses dished out the food, not more nor less than any hand deserved, but fair, at a time when some trail bosses would have let a woman go hungry rather than admit she belonged among them. When a rattlesnake spooked her horse badly enough to nearly throw her on the second week out, it was Clyde who was at her side before the dust settled, checking her over with quick, careful hands before either of them thought better of the intimacy of it and stepped back. "You are not hurt," he said, more statement than question, relief plain in his voice despite his effort to keep it businesslike. "I am not hurt," Fanny agreed, breathing hard, her hands still trembling slightly on the reins. "Though I believe that snake nearly finished what the bank started." Clyde almost smiled again, that rare thing she was beginning to watch for. "You have got a hard bark about you, Fanny Maddox." "I have had to grow one," she said, and turned her horse back toward the herd before he could see how much his words had meant to her. It was near the Red River crossing, some 3 weeks into the drive, that the first real trouble found them. The Red River in late May ran swollen and brown with runoff, faster and higher than Clyde had hoped, and he called the outfit to a halt a half-mile back from the crossing to study the water before committing the herd to it. Fanny rode up beside him, and together they sat their horses on a low rise, looking down at the churning water. "It is high," Clyde said, "higher than I like." "Can we cross it?" Fanny asked. "We can, but it will be dangerous. Cattle can drown in a crossing like this if they panic, and men can drown trying to save them. I have seen it happen." He was quiet a moment, weighing something. "We could wait a few days. Let it drop some." "We do not have days to spare, Clyde. We are already behind the pace we need to make Dodge City before the herds ahead of us flood the market and drop the price. Every day we wait is a day closer to that bank deadline." He looked at her, and she could see him wrestling with the decision, torn between caution and the plain fact that she was right about the timing. "If we cross today, I need every hand doing exactly as I say, no hesitation. This is not a place for arguing about who gives the orders." "You will get no argument from me on that," Fanny said. "Tell me what to do." They crossed that afternoon, the whole crew working the herd down to the water's edge in a long column, Clyde and Rafael Ortiz taking the point to swim their horses across first and establish the path, calling back instructions on where the current ran fastest and where the footing held. The cattle balked at the water's edge, as cattle always did, bawling and shoving, and it took the crew nearly 2 hours of hard, dangerous work pushing the herd into the river a few dozen head at a time, keeping them from bunching up and drowning each other in their panic. Fanny rode flank on the upstream side, her heart hammering as she watched steers struggle against the current, watched one young cow go under and come up again, coughing, still swimming. She kept her voice steady, calling to the cattle the way Clyde had taught her, low and even, refusing to let her own fear translate into the kind of panic that could spread through a herd like fire through dry grass. It was Ezra, her late husband's young brother, who very nearly drowned that day. His horse stumbled in the current partway across, throwing him, and the boy went under in water too deep and too fast for him to find his footing. Fanny saw it happen from 30 yards away and did not think, only acted, spurring her horse into the deeper water toward him, shouting his name. Clyde saw it too and reached him first, leaning far out of his saddle to grab a fistful of the boy's shirt and haul him up and across his own horse's withers, water streaming off both of them, Ezra coughing and gasping but alive. Fanny reached them a moment later, her own horse chest deep in the current, and the relief on her face when she saw Ezra breathing was so raw and unguarded that Clyde found himself staring at her a beat too long before turning his attention back to getting all 3 of them safely to the far bank. They made camp early that evening on the northern side of the Red River, exhausted, soaked, but with the herd intact and every hand accounted for. Ezra sat wrapped in a blanket near the fire, still shaking though whether from cold or fright Fanny could not say, and she sat beside him a long while, saying little, simply present, the way she imagined Thomas would have wanted her to be for his younger brother. Later, after the boy had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Fanny found Clyde standing apart from the fire, looking back south across the dark water they had crossed. "Thank you," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "For Ezra." "He is part of the outfit," Clyde said. "I would have done the same for any man." "I know that. I am thanking you anyway." He glanced at her sideways, the firelight catching the planes of his face. "You went in after him too, before I ever reached him. That took nerve, Fanny. More nerve than most men on this crew would have shown. He is my husband's brother. I could not do otherwise." "That is not why you did it," Clyde said, quiet but certain. "You did it because that is who you are. I have watched you 3 weeks now, and I have yet to see you hesitate when something needed doing, no matter how hard or how frightening. Prout and the rest of them back in Palo Pinto were fools not to see it. Fanny felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the dying fire behind them. "You did not think much of my chances either, Mr. Sawyer, when we first spoke at the livery stable." "No," he admitted. "I did not. I have changed my mind." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped lower, rougher around the edges. "I have changed my mind about a good many things since Palo Pinto." Neither of them said anything more that night, but something had shifted between them at the edge of that dark river, something neither was yet ready to name, though both carried the weight of it into their separate blankets and lay a long while awake before sleep finally claimed them. The drive continued north through the Indian Territory, across rolling grassland broken by stands of post oak and blackjack, the herd finding good grazing along the way that helped fatten the cattle for market even as it slowed their progress. They crossed paths twice with bands of Kiowa hunters, and though Fanny's stomach had knotted with old fears the first time riders appeared on the horizon, Clyde rode out alone both times to parley, and both times the encounters ended peacefully, with a few head of cattle traded for safe passage and fresh information about water and grass ahead. It was, Clyde explained to her afterward, simply the cost of doing business in a land that had belonged to these people long before any cattleman's trail cut through it. And Fanny found herself agreeing, feeling for the first time a keen discomfort at how little thought she had given, before this journey, to whose land she was driving her cattle across. "It does not seem right," she said to Clyde one evening, "that we walk through here like the land was made for our convenience, when it was theirs generations before any of us thought to put a brand on a cow." Clyde nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "It is not right. I have thought the same many a night on these drives. The treaties keep shrinking their land year on year, and the cattle trails do not help matters none, cutting through what grass and water they have left. I do not know what is to be done about it, Fanny, beyond treating the folks we meet with the respect they are due, and paying fair for what we use of their land when we can. It is not much, but it is something." "It is more than most men on the trail would bother with," Fanny said, and meant it. It was near the middle of June, with the herd well into Kansas Territory and Dodge City, perhaps 2 weeks distant, that Wade and Silas Colby's grumbling finally came to a head. The brothers had been muttering for days about taking orders from a woman, their complaints growing bolder as the drive wore on and the work grew harder, the cattle footsore and cranky in the summer heat, tempers short all around. It came to a boil one evening when Fanny gave an order to shift the bed ground half a mile east, away from a stand of cottonwoods where she had spotted signs of a rattlesnake den, and Wade Colby flatly refused, declaring loud enough for the whole camp to hear that he had not signed on to take orders from a widow woman who did not know the first thing about cattle, and that Clyde ought to be running things proper instead of letting her play trail boss. The camp went quiet. Fanny felt her face flush, more with anger than embarrassment, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Clyde got there first, his voice cold and flat in a way she had not heard from him before. "Wade, you signed on for $30 a month to work this drive under my direction, and my direction includes doing what Mrs. Maddox says regarding her own herd, because she owns every head of cattle out there, and she has earned the right to say where they bed down. You have got exactly 2 choices right now. You can apologize to her and get back to work, or you can collect what wages you are owed and ride out of this camp tonight. I do not much care which, but I will not have a man in this outfit who cannot show the owner of this herd the respect she is due." Wade's face went through several colors, from red to nearly purple, and for a moment Fanny thought there might be real trouble, the kind that ended in fists or worse. But Silas put a hand on his brother's arm, murmured something too low for the others to hear, and after a long, tense moment, Wade muttered a grudging apology in Fanny's direction and stalked off toward his bedroll without another word. Fanny found Clyde alone later, tending to his horse's feet by lantern light. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I could have handled Wade myself." "I do not doubt you could have," Clyde said, not looking up from his work. "But I am trail boss on this drive, and part of my job is making certain every man in this outfit treats the herd's owner with proper respect. I would have done the same if any man had spoken that way to a male owner. You do not get treated worse just because you are a woman, Fanny, not on any drive I am running. Most men would not see it that way." "Most men are fools," Clyde said simply. And there was something in the plain, unadorned way he said it that made Fanny's throat go tight with an emotion she did not immediately recognize, or perhaps recognized too well and was afraid to name. She thought of Thomas then, briefly, the way she still did most days, a pang of grief that had softened over the weeks of hard work into something more like a bruise than an open wound. Thomas had loved her in his own way, a steady, practical love built on shared work and shared purpose, but he had never once told her she deserved respect simply for being who she was. It had not occurred to either of them in the 4 years of their marriage that such a thing needed saying. She was beginning to understand, watching Clyde Sawyer work by lantern light with his sleeves rolled up and his gray eyes fixed on his task, that there were different ways for a man to show a woman he valued her, and that some of those ways ran a good deal deeper than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. The stampede came 2 nights later, in the dark hours before dawn, when a sudden crack of dry lightning split the sky without warning, and 1,100 head of already nervous longhorn cattle came up off the ground as one and ran. Fanny woke to the thunder of hooves and Clyde's voice shouting orders into the darkness, and she was up and in the saddle faster than she would have believed possible, her heart pounding as she rode toward the sound of the panicked herd, guided more by instinct and the shapes of other riders than by any clear sight in the moonless dark. The trick to stopping a stampede, Clyde had told her weeks before, almost as an afterthought during a quiet evening around the fire, was not to try to stop the herd head-on but to bend it, to get riders up alongside the leaders and turn them gradually until the whole herd was running in a great circle, milling in on itself until exhaustion did what no rider's strength alone could accomplish. Fanny found herself alongside Rafael Ortiz on the northern flank of the running herd, both of them pushing their horses to a dangerous gallop through darkness thick enough to hide gopher holes and low branches, and any number of things that could break a horse's leg or a rider's neck. She could hear Clyde's voice somewhere ahead, calling to the lead steers, and gradually, agonizingly, she felt the herd's direction begin to bend, the thundering mass curving northward and then eastward and finally beginning to circle, the cattle at the center slowing as those on the outside continued to press, until at last the whole panicked mass ground down into a tight, exhausted, bawling knot of animals standing in the pale gray light of approaching dawn. They had lost perhaps 30 head in the stampede, some to broken legs that had to be put down, others simply scattered into the darkness and not yet accounted for. Tobias had taken a bad fall from his horse and broken his wrist, though he would live and would even, Clyde assured him, be able to ride again within a few weeks with the arm properly splinted. It could have been far worse, and everyone in the camp knew it. Fanny found Clyde sitting on an overturned water barrel near the chuck wagon as the sun came fully up, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cool morning air, a long shallow cut across his forearm where a branch had caught him in the darkness. She knelt beside him without asking and began cleaning the wound with water from her canteen and a strip of clean cloth from her saddlebag, and he let her, watching her face in the growing light rather than her hands. "You did well out there tonight," he said quietly. "Riding flank in the dark like that is dangerous work even for an experienced hand." "I had a good teacher," Fanny said, not looking up from her work. "I did not teach you nerve, Fanny. That was already in you before I ever met you." She finished wrapping the cloth around his arm and tied it off, and when she finally looked up at him, their faces were close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes give way to something else entirely, something warm and unguarded that made her breath catch in her throat. "Clyde," she started, not entirely certain what she meant to say. "I know," he said before she could finish. I feel it too, Fanny. I have felt it since that night at the Red River, maybe before. I have been trying to tell myself it is not proper. You being a widow not 3 months, and me being your hired man on this drive. But I am running out of ways to convince myself of that. I do not care what is proper, Fanny said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. I care about what is true, and it is true that I have come to depend on you for a great deal more than trail work, Clyde Sawyer, and I do not think that dependence is going away once we reach Dodge City. He reached up then and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his rough, calloused fingers gentle against her sun-browned skin, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the camp waking slowly around them, the smell of Moses's coffee beginning to drift on the morning air. "When this drive is finished," Clyde said finally, "and your business with the bank is settled, I would like your permission to court you properly, Fanny. Not because you need a man to run your ranch. I have watched you these past weeks, and I know full well you do not need any man for that. But because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the day you shook my hand outside that livery stable, and I do not expect that feeling is going to fade." Fanny felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unbidden, and she laughed a little at herself even as she wiped them away. "I would like that very much, Clyde. Though I expect we ought to finish getting 1,100 head of cattle to Dodge City first." "I expect we ought," he agreed, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Fanny Maddox felt something in her chest that was not grief or worry or grim determination, but something lighter, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The last 2 weeks of the drive passed with the particular blend of exhaustion and anticipation that comes near the end of any long journey. The herd, footsore but healthy, grew visibly fatter on the rich Kansas grass, and word reached them from other drovers on the trail that the market at Dodge City was holding steady, not yet flooded by the season's herds, which meant good prices if they could get there before the rush. Fanny and Clyde found small moments together in the midst of the work, a shared look across the herd at midday, a few quiet minutes by the fire after the rest of the camp had turned in, his hand finding hers in the darkness when no one else was watching. It was not the kind of courtship either of them had imagined for themselves, conducted as it was in the saddle and around campfires, and amid the constant demands of 1,100 head of cattle, but it suited them both, Fanny thought, better than any parlor courtship back in Palo Pinto ever could have. They reached the outskirts of Dodge City on the 14th of July, having covered better than 600 miles in just over 10 weeks, and Fanny sat her horse on a rise overlooking the sprawling cattle pens and the raw, bustling frontier town beyond them, and felt a wave of relief and pride so profound it nearly brought her to tears. "We made it," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, though Clyde, riding beside her as he so often did now, heard her plainly. "You made it," he corrected gently. "Every man on this crew, myself included, works for you, Fanny. This herd is yours, and the credit for getting it here belongs to you most of all. I could not have done it without every one of you," she said. "Without you." "Maybe not," Clyde allowed, "but you would have found a way. I have come to believe that about you, these past weeks. You are not the kind of woman who fails simply because the odds say you should." They drove the herd into the holding pens outside Dodge City that afternoon, and the following morning Fanny walked into the offices of the cattle buyer, a heavyset man named Otis Pruitt, who represented the Kansas Pacific stockyards, wearing her best traveling dress rather than trail clothes for the first time in 10 weeks. Her chin held high despite the way the clerks in the office stared at a woman come to negotiate cattle prices on her own account. Pruitt tried, as she had half expected he might, to lowball her, offering $18 a head on the strength of what he claimed was a softening market. But Fanny had spent 10 weeks learning every detail of her herd's condition and every scrap of market information Clyde and the other hands could gather from drovers along the trail, and she countered with a figure of $26 a head, backed by hard facts about her cattle's weight and condition and the current state of demand at the railhead. Prout blustered and hemmed for the better part of an hour, but in the end he agreed to $24 a head, a price that would have satisfied even Thomas, and Fanny walked out of that office with a bank draft in her reticule worth more money than she had ever held at one time in her entire life. $26,400, minus the crew's wages and shares, minus expenses for supplies along the trail, still left her with more than enough to pay off the $1,100 note at the Fort Worth Bank several times over, with a substantial sum remaining to invest back into the ranch, perhaps even enough to buy more breeding stock and hire on permanent hands for the coming years. She found Clyde waiting outside the cattle buyer's office, and when she showed him the bank draft his eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Prout does not usually pay that generous," he said. "You must have driven a hard bargain." "I learned from a hard bargainer," Fanny said, smiling. 10 weeks watching you argue prices for supplies along the trail taught me a thing or two about not backing down." That evening, the whole crew gathered at one of the more respectable establishments in Dodge City for a celebratory supper, paid for out of Fanny's own pocket as a thank you for their work. And even Wade Colby, who had grumbled through much of the drive, raised his glass of sarsaparilla to toast Fanny's success with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. "I will admit I had my doubts, Mrs. Maddox," he said, somewhat sheepishly. "I am glad to say you proved me wrong. You are not the only one, Mr. Colby," Fanny said, and could not help glancing at Clyde as she said it, remembering the doubt in his own eyes the day they first met outside the livery stable. It was after that supper, with the summer stars bright overhead, and the noise of Dodge City's rowdier establishments carrying faintly on the warm night air, that Clyde walked Fanny back to the boarding house where she had taken a room, and stopped with her on the porch beneath a lantern that cast a soft golden light over both their faces. "I meant what I said back on the trail," Clyde said, somewhat awkwardly, turning his hat in his hands the way a much younger man might. "About wanting to court you proper, once your business here was finished. I do not know exactly how a man is supposed to go about courting a woman who has just proven herself the toughest trail boss I have ever ridden with, but I would like to try, if you will let me." Fanny laughed, a warm, unguarded sound, and reached out to take his hat from his nervous hands and set it on the porch railing beside them. "I have never much cared for the way most courting is supposed to go, Clyde. I think we ought to make up our own rules, the same way we have made up our own rules for near about everything else these past 10 weeks. "What rules would those be?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice low. "Well," Fanny said, "I think the first rule ought to be that you kiss me right now, before either of us find some fool reason to talk ourselves out of it." Clyde Sawyer did not need to be told twice. He cupped her face in his weathered hands, gentle despite their roughness, and kissed her there on the boarding house porch under the lantern light, slow and thorough and full of 10 weeks' worth of feeling neither of them had allowed themselves to voice until now. When they finally broke apart, both of them a little breathless, Fanny rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, beneath her palm. "I loved my husband," she said quietly, not as an apology but as a simple truth that needed saying. "I do not want you to think what I feel for you diminishes that." "I would never think that," Clyde said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thomas Maddox built something worth fighting for, Fanny, and you fought for it harder than any man I have ever ridden with. I do not aim to replace what you had with him. I only hope in time to build something worth having alongside you if you will let me." "I will let you," Fanny said, and kissed him again to prove it. They spent 3 days in Dodge City settling accounts and purchasing supplies for the ranch, and Fanny sent a telegram ahead to the Fort Worth Bank informing them that the Maddox note would be paid in full upon her return, a message that she suspected would cause no small amount of consternation among those who had been counting on her failure. Then the crew turned their horses south for the long ride home, lighter and faster without 1,100 head of cattle to slow their progress, and the journey back to Palo Pinto County took barely 3 weeks compared to the 10 it had taken to drive the herd north. They rode into Palo Pinto on a bright morning in early August, and word of Fanny's success had apparently traveled ahead of them, because a small crowd had gathered outside the general store, drawn by curiosity and no small amount of disbelief. Fanny rode at the head of the column beside Clyde, her back straight, her chin high, wearing the same trail-worn clothes she had worn for most of the journey, unwilling to pretend at respectability she had earned through hard, honest work. Jasper Coyle was among those gathered, and his expression when he saw the bank draft Fanny produced, more than sufficient to cover her note several times over, was a thing Fanny would remember with quiet satisfaction for years to come. "I see you managed to get your herd to market after all, Mrs. Maddox," he said, his voice tight with poorly disguised displeasure. "I did, Mr. Coyle," Fanny said pleasantly. "And I will not be needing your generous offer to buy my ranch after all, this autumn or any other. But I thank you kindly for your concern." The bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Aldous Whitfield, who had been among those most certain Fanny would default on her note, accepted her payment with visible discomfort, muttering something about how he had never doubted her intentions, only her practical ability to see them through, a distinction Fanny found more amusing than insulting given the circumstances. "I understand the doubt, Mr. Whitfield," she said graciously, tucking her receipt into her reticule. "I had my own doubts more than once along that trail. But doubt is not the same as impossibility, and I have found that most things men declare impossible for a woman are simply things no woman has been given a fair chance to attempt." Old man Prout, who had told her so bluntly weeks before that no woman could hold a trail crew in line, tipped his hat to her with what appeared to be genuine respect as she passed. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Maddox," he said gruffly. "I do not say that easy, but I say it honest. You have got more grit than most men I have ridden with." "Thank you, Mr. Prout," Fanny said. "That means a good deal coming from you." Clyde Sawyer stayed on at the Maddox Ranch through that autumn, ostensibly to help Fanny manage the substantial improvements her cattle money had made possible: new breeding stock, repairs to the barn and outbuildings, permanent hands hired on for the coming year. But everyone on the ranch and most everyone in Palo Pinto County understood plainly enough that Clyde's presence had less to do with ranch management and a great deal to do with his intentions toward its owner. They were married that October, on a warm afternoon beneath the same oak tree where Thomas Maddox lay buried on the hill overlooking the ranch, a choice Fanny had made deliberately and explained to Clyde beforehand, wanting him to understand that she carried her first husband's memory not as a burden between them, but as a part of the life that had led her, eventually, to this new happiness. "Thomas would have liked you, I think," she told Clyde the morning of the wedding, as they stood together near the grave before the small gathering of guests arrived. "He respected a man who worked hard and spoke plain and did not waste time on foolishness. That was you from the first day I met you at that livery stable." "I hope he would have," Clyde said. "I know I owe him a debt in a way. If he had not taught you so much about cattle and ranching before he passed, you would never have had the knowledge to drive that herd yourself, and I would never have had the chance to meet you at all." "Perhaps," Fanny said, "or perhaps I would have found my way regardless. I have come to believe, Clyde, that a person's grit comes from somewhere deeper than what any one teacher can give them. Thomas gave me knowledge. You gave me faith that the knowledge was worth something, but the grit, I think, was always mine." "I do not doubt that for a moment," Clyde said, and kissed her softly before the wedding party arrived, sealing a promise between them that needed no further words. The wedding itself was a modest affair by the standards of grander towns further east, held outdoors with a circuit preacher presiding. The whole of the small community gathered on quilts and wagon benches under the wide Texas sky. Moses Freeman stood as Clyde's best man, having decided to stay on permanently at the Maddox Ranch rather than seek another drive. And Ezra, now grown considerably in confidence since his near drowning at the Red River, walked Fanny down the makeshift aisle in place of the father she had lost years before. Even Wade and Silas Colby attended, having likewise stayed on as permanent hands on the ranch, their earlier doubts about Fanny's fitness to lead having been thoroughly and permanently dispelled by 10 weeks on the trail and the substantial wages that had resulted from her success. Rafael Ortiz brought his guitar and played long into the evening after the ceremony concluded, and the whole gathering danced beneath lanterns strung between the ranch house and the barn. And Fanny danced with her new husband under the same stars that had watched over 1,100 head of cattle and 8 trail-weary hands make their way 600 miles to Kansas and back. And she thought, resting her head against Clyde's shoulder as they turned slowly to Raphael's music, that she had never in her whole life felt so thoroughly, completely happy. Their life together on the ranch settled into a rhythm that suited them both, built on the foundation of mutual respect and hard work that had first drawn them together on the trail. Clyde took to ranch ownership with the same steady competence he had shown as a trail boss, and Fanny continued to manage the books and the business dealings with the same sharp intelligence that had negotiated a hard bargain with Otis Pruitt in Dodge City. And between them, the Maddox-Sawyer Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the county, prospered steadily through the years that followed. They drove cattle to market 3 more times over the following 6 years, each time with Clyde as trail boss and Fanny riding alongside him, sometimes pregnant, once with a nursing infant strapped in a sling against her chest for the first 2 weeks of the journey, until Clyde insisted, with more worry than she had ever heard in his voice before or since, that she stay behind at the ranch and let the crew handle that particular drive without her direct participation. She had grumbled about it for a week before finally relenting, though she made certain the crew understood plainly that she expected a full accounting upon their return, a demand Clyde met with an indulgent smile and a promise that had made her laugh despite herself. Their first child, a son they named Thomas Clyde Sawyer in honor of both the husband Fanny had lost and the husband she had found, was born in the spring of 1879, less than a year after the wedding, a robust, healthy boy who grew up practically in the saddle, riding before he could properly walk, much to his mother's simultaneous pride and exasperation. Their second child, a daughter named Grace, arrived 2 years later, followed by another son, Ezra, named for the young man who had nearly drowned at the Red River and who had grown, by then, into a capable and trusted foreman on the ranch in his own right, having chosen to make his life there rather than seek his fortune elsewhere. Fanny Maddox Sawyer, as she came to sign her name in later years, never did entirely give up the habit of asking more questions than most folks thought a proper rancher's wife needed to ask, and Clyde never once tried to discourage her from it, understanding better than most men of his era that the sharp, questioning mind that had driven 1,100 head of cattle 600 miles to save her ranch was precisely the mind that had made their partnership, in business and in marriage both, as strong and enduring as it proved to be. In the years that followed, as the Maddox-Sawyer Ranch grew into one of the more respected cattle operations in Palo Pinto County, young women from throughout the region would sometimes seek Fanny out for advice, having heard the story of the cattle drive widow who had outlasted every man who doubted her. And Fanny always gave the same answer, delivered with the same steady conviction she had carried since that first difficult night at her kitchen table with Thomas's ledger book open before her. Grit is not something a person is born with in fixed supply, she would tell them. It is something a person finds, generally in the moment they need it most, when every voice around them says the task is impossible. I did not know I had the grit to drive that herd until I had no other choice but to try. You will find the same is true of most things worth doing in this life. Clyde Sawyer lived to see his sons grow into capable ranchers in their own right, and his daughter marry a good man from a neighboring spread. And he never once, in all the years of their marriage, doubted that marrying Fanny Maddox had been the finest decision of his entire life. a sentiment he expressed to her often, usually in quiet moments at the end of long days, when the work was done, and the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over land that Fanny had fought, against every doubt and every doubter, to keep and to build into something lasting. "I doubted you too, that first day at the livery stable," he told her once, decades later, when their hair had gone gray and their children had children of their own scattered across the growing ranches of West Texas. "I want you to know I have never stopped being grateful you proved me wrong." "You were not wrong to doubt, Clyde," Fanny said, taking his weathered hand in hers, the same hand that had once cleaned a cut on his forearm by the light of a Kansas dawn. "You were simply wise enough to change your mind when the evidence gave you reason to. That is more than most men manage in a lifetime." "I had good reason," Clyde said, smiling the way he still did after all these years whenever he looked at her. "The finest reason I ever had for anything." And there on the porch of the ranch that Fanny Maddox had refused to lose, built now into a legacy that would carry her name and Clyde's forward through generations of Sawyers who would ranch that same Texas land, the cattle drive widow who had outlasted every man who doubted her grit sat beside the one man who had never doubted her for long, and watched the sun go down golden over country she had claimed as thoroughly her own as any woman in the history of that wild, unforgiving, and ultimately generous land. They lived to see the 20th century arrive, the ranch passing eventually into the capable hands of their eldest son Thomas, who ran it with the same combination of hard-nosed practicality and genuine fairness that his parents had modeled for him since childhood. Fanny Maddox Sawyer died in her sleep in the spring of 1921, at the age of 69, with Clyde beside her, and he followed her less than a year later, unable, as their children would say for years afterward, to imagine a world that did not have Fanny in it. They were buried together on that same hill overlooking the ranch, not far from where Thomas Maddox had been laid to rest decades before, 3 graves marking the full and complicated history of a woman who had refused, against every expectation of her time, to let doubt or grief, or the scorn of small-minded men determine the course of her own life. The story of the cattle drive widow who had driven 1,100 head of longhorn, cattle 600 miles to Dodge City, who had outlasted every man who doubted her grit and found, at the end of that impossible journey, a love as sturdy and enduring as the land itself, became something of a local legend throughout Palo Pinto County, told and retold at gatherings and family suppers for generations afterward. A reminder to every young woman who heard it that the measure of a person's worth was never fixed by the doubts of others, but earned, one hard and honest day at a time, through the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on what mattered most.